We're here tonight to celebrate the debut novel by Jennifer Rosner, The Yellow Bird Sings. The book is set in 1941. The book is set in Poland, excuse me. It follows a 5-year-old musical prodigy and her mother who are both hiding from the Nazis after the rest of their family has been murdered. Writing in the New York Times, Mary Beth Keane says, Rosner's exquisite, heartrending debut novel is proof that there's always going to be room for another story about World War II, and goes on to say that this is an absolutely beautiful and necessary novel, full of heartbreak, but also hope about the bond between mother and daughter and the sacrifices made for love. With Jennifer here in conversation is the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of historical fiction, Kate Quinn. A native of Southern California, she attended Boston University, where she earned a bachelor's and master's degree in classical voice. She's written 4 novels in the Empress of Rome saga and 2 books in the Italian Renaissance before turning to the 20th century with the Alice Network and The Huntress. All have been translated into multiple languages. Kate and her husband now live in San Diego with 2 rescue dogs. And Jennifer Rosner is the author of the memoir, If a Tree Falls, A Family's Quest to Hear and Be Heard. Her children's book, The Mitten String, is a Sidney Taylor Book Award notable. Jennifer's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Massachusetts Review, The Forward, Good Housekeeping, and elsewhere. She lives in Western Massachusetts with her family. And for those of you who are watching at home, if you have questions for the authors at any point throughout the program, please add them in the comments and we'll pass them along. We will have time for a Q&A at the end of the talk. Thank you all so much for joining us, Jennifer and Kate. I will turn it over to you now. Thank you both for being here.
So much for having us, and really we just want to add our own shout out that anybody who is staying at home right now, I don't know about you, but books are keeping me sane, and personally I can't think of a better way to help support local businesses than by ordering our books from local indie bookstores. So whether it is buying from Booksmith or whether it is ordering from your local store, please do it. We've got to keep these places around. But anyway, I was hoping that we could, first of all, this is Jennifer's and my first time actually seeing each other face to face. I gave her book a cover quote a while back ago. And Jennifer, am I going to totally embarrass you if I just gush about it for a little bit?
Oh, no. You're very sweet.
Yes, I'm going to gush about the Yellow Bird Sings. And first of all, I'm going to say, at some point in this convo, I'm probably going to call it Where the Yellow Bird Sings, because that damn Crawdads book is everywhere. And now I want to add the where, because it already has sings. But I know it is The Yellow Bird Sings. So we'll talk about the yellow bird later. And what does that mean? Because that's a really interesting discussion. But I read this book and I was really blown away, and for a whole variety of reasons. But it was one of the easiest cover quotes I ever had to write, because the first thing I thought was, this is Emma Donohue's Room meets World War II. And that's because she had, what Jennifer has is this young child who tells a great deal of the story and who does not understand the world around her, why they're hiding, what are the enemies that are seeking to kill them, or why. And so it's up to her mother to try to build this fantasy world to keep her distracted. And I'm so impressed by that, because I speak as someone who's written a couple of child narrator characters, and mainly it has made me think never again, because it is so hard to have a child narrator who is in the moment and who is, not annoying you the way, so often small children can do in real life, and who is observing things in a way that is putting the story forward. And you made it look so easy. So I was so impressed by that. So that's that is absolutely, first of all, my bit of, groveling about the book, which I really did love. And also, we'll talk a bit about this as well. It's like, I kept seeing connections to the latest book that I had written, which is The Huntress. And that really kind of, astounded me too, because it's amazing sometimes how personal a reading experience can be, and how something that you have can life even more when you're reading something else. But first of all, we have a few questions about what we'd like to talk about with this book. So how did you come to the subject of this story? I mean, what inspired you to write this?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for all those things you said. And I do want to talk about the connections to The Huntress as we go along, but that we, we're unaware, sort of have some synchronicity. So I have to say that my background is I'm a philosophy professor, and I wasn't that kid who wanted to be a writer since they were, 8 or whatever. I ended up, when I had children, they were both born deaf, and that was really a surprise and kind of a shock at first. And I started writing creatively for the first time. So the other writing I had done was philosophy writing, which really isn't that fun. And I started just, I don't know, trying to express what was happening to us with the deafness. And those like little snippets of things that I had been just writing to process were, they kind of eventually became my memoir, If a Tree Falls. And I went and gave some book talks about the memoir, and I was talking about how we were encouraging our children to, they were wearing hearing technology, and we were encouraging every vocalization. So even if they were like screaming in a restaurant, we were happy because they were making sound. And after this talk, a woman came over to me and she described her childhood experience of hiding in a shoemaker's attic with her mom, for close to 2 years, and she had to be silent and still. And I just was blown away by that, just thinking about that experience, what it must have been like for that child and what it must have been like for that mother. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And in a way, it was like the opposite enterprise I was engaged in, because we were working so hard to get our children to talk. And it really stuck with me. And I ended up being in touch with her and interviewing her, and then interviewing many other hidden children. But that was like the seed of the story, was meeting this woman and hearing her childhood experience.
Yeah, and that really is the thing that's the fascinating part about the book, because you have the point of view of the mother, who is very, very cognizant of, the fact that there are Nazis who are trying to kill and round up Jews. And she knows that her family has already been rounded up, and it's their luck that she and her child have escaped. They have this very tenuous position hiding, in a barn. And the fact is she has to keep her daughter quiet. And yet, what are you doing developmentally to a child, when they cannot verbalize, they cannot vocalize? And then the fact is that your child in particular in this book, she has this tremendous musical gift. She wants to sing, she wants to vocalize, especially in music. And then you see inside her voice that, in a way, though, the music, even though it goes underground in her, it still is the thing that keeps her spirit alive, even though she's the one who doesn't really understand why her mother keeps playing these games to get her to be quiet and so forth, and she doesn't really want to do it. But still, the music is still very much part of her, even when she can't vocalize it. So when you were talking about speaking with some more of these hidden children, I mean, really, what was that like? How many were you able to contact?
I had really full interviews with about a dozen hidden children. There were other people who, they didn't really want to sit down and be interviewed. They were willing to have me come, and when they presented to a high school, because some of them do kind of speeches, but they're very controlled and they decide what to say, but they didn't want to go meet with me and have me lead the way, because maybe it was too tender and difficult. But the people who I did interview, I had these very long, very emotional conversations, and they all had really different stories, all incredibly moving and full of so much resilience and innovation and kind of surprise. I mean, things that if as a fiction writer I had come up with some of the plots that they said, you would be like, that's ridiculous, that would never have happened. And that's what was so interesting about the survival, is some stuff happened that you couldn't even get away with as a fiction writer, because it seems so crazy. But there were,
I would agree with that, because fiction is real life is always stranger than fiction. In fact, I always tend to think that's the fun place about the author's note. It's not just the place to say, this is where I shifted a date, and this is where I changed this for the sake of the story, and to make it better. It's also the place to say, this is the part that I did not make up, because I would not have had the nerve to make up anything this bonkers.
Right. And at first, when you think about all the different stories, they, one person hid in plain sight at a neighbor's farm, and she wore a cross and just hoped that no other neighbor would denounce her, and someone else had been smuggled over against a wall. And these are stories that we've heard of before, but there would be stories embedded in these stories, about one of them going to a bunker. Her family brought their goose with them to a bunker and fed it on a porcelain dish. And then years later, when everything had been bombed out, she went back to the spot and saw a shard of the dish and knew she was in the place where the bunker was, and found this pipe where her father hid money. I mean, all these crazy things where, it's just astonishing. But I think that on the other, besides sort of all the kind of crazy things that happened, was this sort of emotional depth of feeling, some of which was really so powerful. I mean, the feelings of those who had been separated from their parents, feeling this rejection that even like 75 years later, they still carried, even though they knew that they were given away in order to be saved. And that played a big role in my writing, not just those feelings, but also like imagining that a parent who gave up a child in order for this child to live would feel things like guilt or shame that, you know, anyone from the outside would say, well, you know, obviously you did it so they would live, but it's these like raw, basic emotions that we can't really explain. You know, I mean, people just feel them when they have to separate like this. So it was these emotional points that were really moving in the interviews, and that I really wanted to honor in the writing of this novel.
Yeah, that really was one of the moving things. Is it doesn't really matter how often we tell ourselves you're not to blame. You know, you are the last person to blame here. It's these wounds go so deep. And, you know, without giving anything away, I do love the way that you were able to carry on past the war, and we were able to see this wonderful spark of hope at the end. And I do want to make sure people know that, like, you know, I know that this is a time where it feels hard to be reading anything that's going to be heavy. And, you know, we want to read toward things that will uplift the spirit. This is a book that will absolutely uplift the spirit, even though it deals with some very heavy issues. So that is another reason I think you should absolutely buy it now. This book takes place largely in Poland. What kind of traveling did you do, to do your research here? Because I know you did travel.
I did. So I first, having written a draft of it, I started looking for a guide, and I found someone who was really an amazing man, and he, had me send the manuscript in advance, and then and read it. And when I got there, he took me to these areas of Poland that were really essentially the settings of my novel. He took me to like these areas of farmland where there would be like the farmhouse and the barn, and the way the road curved and how it was set up and how close to the next neighbor, all these sort of things that I had been like wondering about logistically and how it might work. And I was right there seeing things like that. And he took me to a convent where Jewish children had been hidden. And it was like these sensory moments, like when you walk into the convent and there's like mushroom soup, the smell of mushroom soup, and like the way your feet like, kind of resound on the floor, and all these things that I had been kind of imagining in Western Massachusetts at my window seat, kind of either being confirmed or disconfirmed. Like, one thing was that, I had kind of imagined the convent more grand. And then when I got there and he said, we're a poorer country. I mean, it would be brick, not stone. Things like that were really interesting. And he, in addition to taking me to these places and also like a primeval forest, and we went in winter so I could understand what it would be like for my character to be like living in a forest in winter. It was very cold, and I brought my daughter, and I still haven't really heard the end of that part. So we were in this freezing forest for a long time. But anyway, he also at night,
next time, I could just see her say, "Mom, next time, can you please like write a book set in Versailles, and you can take me there, and we'll be drinking champagne and walking through Versailles like in the summertime."
Exactly. We don't need winter in Poland. I agree. I've been thinking a lot about that. And then at night, he actually was translating for me texts that were only in Polish, and that he thought might be relevant. And so we had this incredible trip to Poland where I learned so many things, and also like consulted about names, and that there were sort of economic connotations to names that I wasn't aware of, and all kinds of things like that. And in addition to going to Poland, I went to Tel Aviv to meet this violin maker named Amnon Weinstein, who has been like rebuilding violins from the Holocaust, and they've been being played around the world in something called Violins of Hope. And I spent a lot of time in his workshop because there's a character who's a violin maker, and also because the child's a violin prodigy. And the person who hooked me up with this violin maker is this masterclass violinist who actually consulted with me about all the music in the novel, about the pieces, and how she'd be practicing, what order she would learn some of these things. And because knowing how a prodigy would develop was something I needed someone's expertise in. And I mean, I always feel like, at least for me, I don't know if you feel this way, but it's like writing a novel, it really does take a village, because there are just these areas of of expertise and you need to consult with the, the historian, or for me, like the tracker, because my character moves through the woods and she can't leave a trace. So I learned about how you would move without bending the leaves or grass. Like you'd roll your feet in a certain way, and like a mushroom forager, all these kind of random things where my like internet history looks like I'm insane. And I think writers all have that kind of crazy internet history because you search these little random things all the time. And
yeah, I will tell you, my research that I did for The Huntress was, involved some truly frightening email exchanges for anybody who would have been looking over my shoulder. There was literally one occasion where, I'm trying the best to find the best way to email a gun expert and say, I'm not insane and I'm not planning to murder anyone, but can you tell me how I would rig a shotgun to blow up in somebody's face and hopefully kill and hopefully maim and kill them? No pressure.
Right.
And then there was another time when I was, I literally was emailing an ER physician with, this exchange that went like, okay, I need somebody dead. He's got to suffer first. He's going to be suffering a shotgun blast near the face. How long has he got? And he's emailing me back with like, okay, do you want him to suffer? And I'm like, yeah, some suffering is good. You want him to communicate? No communication. There cannot be secrets being exchanged here. And he's like, all right. And he's giving me, it's like, you're going to need a fractured eye orbital and a fractured this and that. And, I was just looking at this and just, hello, Homeland Security.
Exactly.
I'm going to see somebody on the doorstep. But I will say one thing where our research definitely overlaps is that I had a very similar set of inquiries with a violinist who I know. And that is because in The Huntress, and this was where I promised I would say something about what it is that these books have in common that really pinged me in this wonderfully intimate way when I was reading this, was that I also have a young violin prodigy in my book, The Huntress, where her name is Ruth, and again, very much like the young girl in Jennifer's novel, she spent her war in Europe hiding. And I know that, the only thing you really know is that she and her mother spent their time in hiding, and that Ruth remembers very, very little about this time, except that she saw some traumatic things that left her with some damage afterwards, some very dark, flinches from things instinctively. But music is something she remembers. In her case, it was, she gravitates very strongly toward a violin the first time that, she's able to. And she ends up being a little bit of a prodigy as well. So in a way, and I'm trying to say this very carefully, so without spoilers for anyone who's not read The Huntress and who hasn't read The Yellowbird Sings, people have asked me, well, have you considered writing Ruth's story? Like, what did happen to her during the war? And I now kind of feel like I don't have to. I felt like in The Yellowbird Sings, I was almost reading a very close version of what Ruth's story could have been. Now, obviously, very different things happen, especially when my Ruth and her mother came out of their attic and came out of hiding. Very different things happened to them than happened to Jennifer's mother and daughter. But at the same time, I felt like there were some wonderful parallels, and I also felt like Jennifer wrote it a lot better than I could. I don't think I have it in me to write Emma Donohue's Room meets World War II. So now I can just tell all of you who always wonder what Ruth's story is, go read this book. It's something kind of like that, at least. That's how I think of it anyway. But I did have some of those same emails with, asking a violinist, like, how young do children get started? And do they start with scales, simple pieces?
Exactly.
When does perfect pitch start to make itself known? So yeah, that was definitely, it's fun to see some overlap there.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that we both were drawn to having a musical child, because one thing that I felt is that as I met more survivors, I feel like art plays such a role. The people who survive find a way to either like locate or express beauty somehow. I think it's like how people get through. So it may not be accidental that many people who survive were drawing or writing poetry or playing music or something, or hearing it in their head, even if they couldn't play it or something like that. So,
well, think about the time we're living in right now. I mean, and I am certainly not in any way equating having to self-isolate at home with, anything along the lines of genocide. Do not ever think I'm saying that. But the idea that we are living in an extraordinary time where we are having to be thrown on our own inner resources. and on not just on our own inner resources, but art is coming to the rescue in a way that I think I've seen happen almost universally. I mean, people are still reading, they're making music, they are relying on music, on drama, on poetry, on all kinds of things to keep that body and soul together. I mean, I don't know about you, but it seemed like I've seen more stories like that than almost anything else, like along the heartening side of things. When you,
I agree. I agree. And especially, when there were all those, you could see in these videos of different Italians in different parts of Italy singing, into each other's window. I mean, it was heartening, right?
that was wonderful.
Yeah.
So is that really why you decided to go with sort of the music theme in the book? That's sort of why you glommed onto that thematically?
I mean, I had a really personal reason, actually, which was that my father played violin every day of my whole life, and most of his life. So I grew up hearing someone practice the violin every day. And I saw that for him, playing violin was like a way of connecting to his roots in a certain way. There was a way it connected him to his family. I think it connected him to Judaism. I just really kind of came to understand the connective power of music. And also like the transportive power of it, the way, it can, even when things aren't going so great, you can sort of escape with it. And so I think I kind of knew it firsthand. And we both have this other thing we share, which is that we are trained singers. And one of the things is that I felt in certain ways unheard as a child, but except for when I sang, I felt heard. Like everyone sort of stopped when I sang. And I think I understood that too as like a real connective tissue. And so I think having this family, the mom who plays the cello, the daughter plays the violin, but also her father had played violin, her grandfather was a violin maker. So there was this whole connective sort of tissue in the family through music. And I think that was very sort of a personally driven thing, knowing it firsthand.
Yeah, there's another connection too, because my father was a jazz musician. So I grew up with all this chunking in the background of chords and jazz riffs. His was more like clarinet and saxophone and so forth, which you couldn't play all that quietly, but I grew up loving it. So, Mose Allison riffs in the background, definitely a formative thing. Now, the next question I was thinking of actually also ties into Rena's question, which came in on our Facebook page, which is the yellow bird. What is the yellow bird, and really how did you come up with that as an idea, and then as also this really wonderful, interesting title?
Yeah, I mean, the initial inspiration for giving Shira this bird, well, there were two real reasons. One is that, my older daughter always had these imaginary friends when she was little. And we were always not sure. And I don't know if you ever read that piece by Adam Gopnik in the New Yorker about Mr. Ravioli, where he was worried that his daughter's imaginary friend was too busy to hang out with her sometimes. This girl was in New Yorker, and Mr. Ravioli was so busy in New York or something. But anyway, I sort of saw this in action, having an imaginary friend or something. But I kind of felt that Shira in the barn, she had her mother and she did have her blanket, but I wanted her to have something else of comfort. But also I had heard of a story of a girl who in a trauma had just cupped her hands. She had gone silent, cupped her hands, and just kept her hands cupped around this, probably an imaginary bird. And that kind of stuck with me too, but because I thought that if it was a bird, it could sing out the songs or music that Shira composed in her head. So she would have this vehicle or a voice while she had to be silent in the barn. I mean, later her violin could be the vehicle or the voice, but in the barn, she had the bird. And what I really grew to appreciate was that I could sort of intertwine, so that the mom who's telling these stories every night, trying to occupy the time, she was whispering stories about a brave girl and her bird, so that the mom also took part in this thing, and the bird became a connection between the mom and the child as well. So this bird served a lot of purposes. It also served kind of as a way in which I could bring subtext to the novel. So as you had said, there were parts where I'm stuck with a 5-year-old's point of view, and the 5-year-old doesn't know everything. And doesn't even sometimes understand herself. And so this bird can be acting out in a certain way to tell the reader something about the emotional complexity that the daughter would never be able to articulate. And I found that to be very useful. And then in terms of title, everyone must know that titles are so hard, right? And, the publisher is essentially in charge of, the author can have some say maybe, it depends on your relationship with your publisher, but sometimes it's up to them. But we were very collaborative, and we were brainstorming titles, and there were various things happening. And but it turned out that the first sentence of the novel is something like, the girl is forbidden from making a sound, so the yellow bird sings. And we just realized, that's the yellow bird sings, like, let's grab that. But we tried some other things first, and they were really quite bad. So I'm really glad that we came up with a good title after a lot of struggle.
Yeah, the title wars thing can really be quite funny. I mean, if there's anything I've learned, it's one of those things where sometimes the title it's there right from the beginning, and you don't have to have any arguments about it, and that's great. And then there are sometimes when nobody knows what the title is, and then you end up doing this thing where it's like you're coming up with any idea you can remotely come up with is going in a list. You're just throwing words together like random word salad, and after a while the words stop making sense. You just have this alphabet soup of words, and you start thinking, after a while you've thrown the words around so much they don't mean anything anymore, and you're starting to think things like yellow. What kind of a word is yellow anyway? Does that even sound like a real word? Because after a while it stops looking like a real word because you've seen it so much. And then you send the whole list off to the publisher, and the other thing I've learned is you really need to take a second look at that list before you send it off, because they will inevitably pick the one that you actually don't like.
Yeah.
And
we had some go-arounds. Yeah.
And then the thing is they'll send it back. You'll be like, I hate that title. And then they will ask for some justification. Well, why did you suggest it? And it's like, I wasn't in any sense making sense at that point. We're in title wars. Nothing makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, the title wars that's definitely a thing that's happened. I remember The Huntress went through something like 4 titles. It was titled Dark Room to start. And then it was titled The Night Sisters. And then it was also titled, like, wanted to title it Rusalka, after the lake water myth that kind of goes through the whole thing. And that was, kind of too foreign of a word. That didn't work. And then finally we settled on The Huntress, but it was like, for a while, like the Ice Huntress, the Snow Huntress, the something Huntress, the who knows what Huntress. And it's like, no, just The Huntress. But it's like, that was one book that went through a lot of title iterations.
I was arguing for the word tremolo, because the bird, because there's this point where the birds chirp, like, morphs from this beautiful chirp to a kind of stressed out tremolo, and it's just like this quavering between 2 notes, and I thought it was sort of symbolic about the mother and daughter relationship and all this stuff, and they were like, tremolo, like, no one is gonna know what that means, you can't name your book Tremolo. And we just went through a lot of things like that.
I'm a nerd, and I would have known.
Yeah, but I know there would be some subset of people who knew. And at one point there was the Yellowbird Sonata, and I thought, a little pretentious, maybe. I don't know. And then I was so happy when we came up with the Yellowbird Sings, because I like that it's an active verb. Somehow it just, it was good. But my working title for the whole time was Hidden, and I thought that was a reasonable title. And my editor was like, it's not going to be hidden. Like, that was obvious to her from the start. And I was like, oh, it's in my every file, but okay.
The worst thing that happens is when you end up with a title which has happened to me, where it actually really has nothing to do with anything that's in the book. So then you end up going through on your next editorial pass, sort of like trying to shoehorn references to the title in, or like trying to,
I've done that.
Trying to really suddenly, like, hammer and tongs that, little bit of thematic relationship, so the book does not have a completely random title, but I've had that happen too.
I was going to say, you might find the word tremolo more often than it was in one. At the time I was trying to push for the title Tremolo, I added like 5 tremolo references, but I think maybe a couple came out. I don't know. Yeah.
So what in the end, before we go on to our Q&A, what in the end do you think, in essence, Yellowbird Sings is really about?
Yeah, I know. And I always feel like, maybe, at least for me, I learned this at the end. I don't learn it necessarily as, I don't come in knowing what it's about. I don't know. I'm not such a planner. What?
You too? I'm exactly the same way.
Yeah, just kind but I think, so I knew it was about this, like, unbreakable connection between a mother and daughter, but I really think it's about the, like, crucial place of creativity and beauty and human survival. I think that's, like, ultimately what this book is about. And that kind of emerged over time, and it kind of essentially when the ending got hammered out too, sort of understanding how there's this connective, you know, I don't know, and that's where the hope of this novel is as well, you know, that beauty kind of can save us in a certain way, and something we're learning in our own quarantine.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I have the exact same thing happen. Generally, I'm something like 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the drafting process, and that's when I look back and I realize that like the theme has been rising up out of the water at me, you know, basically, and I realize my subconscious has been tap dancing all over the book, but I rarely am aware of it at the beginning. So I'm glad to know that somebody else works this way.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I had I went to a writing workshop once, but when I was working on my memoir, it's like, it was about, you know, so our these two deaf daughters of mine, my husband and mine, and then also like these two ancestors in my family tree were deaf in the 1800s in Austria. And this writing teacher said, like, what's your story about? Like, oh, well, it's about these two sets of deaf sisters. And she's like, oh, what's it about? I'm like, these two sets of sisters, you know, not even knowing. And then she like said one thing like, oh, is it a, you know, I don't know, it was so interesting how even from the outside, someone can like, I don't know, say something insightful and it like all comes together and you realize that it had been unconscious the entire time. So it's very interesting how the mind works and how writing takes place. But I do think that not knowing helps a lot because it does let your unconscious just drive it. Whereas if I know, my writing gets more contrived. And so I like to kind of be in that blurry place, a little bit unconscious, right? While I'm working. I think it turns out to be more authentic.
Well, it certainly came across that way when I was reading, so I think it worked. We have a couple questions in here. I'm looking at our little chat window here. Do feel free to type any more questions in, and we will be able to see them. We do have them coming through on from Booksmith is helping us out with that. First of those questions being for Jennifer, did you face any language issues when you were doing your travels overseas and you're consulting with experts? And this is from also from Rena.
Yeah. I mean, luckily the guide I had was very adept in English, and I did need a guide. I mean, I couldn't have gone to Poland and just kind of navigated my way. But so I think that kind of buffered me from that. I think that there were language issues later. So when I was inserting some Polish, even just like, you know, Mrs. Whoever in Polish, it's like a dative case or something. There's certain cases that aren't even, you know, like you would have to change the ending of certain words in order for it to be grammatically correct, which I didn't know. But this book is being published in Poland, and a Polish translator helped quite a lot with that. And we imported as much as we could into the English versions and explained later, you know, what we could do and what we couldn't do, sort of in that regard. But yeah, so I think there were a few language issues, but I think we worked them out. Yeah.
All right, so that's one question we have. From Nancy, we have, I loved your book, Jennifer. Are you working on your next novel, and is it another historical fiction?
It is, and I am, and it is. And, you know, I'm very excited, and I was gonna say that I got really inspired by Kate because I was reading her work, and something happened in her novel where in The Huntress there's like a cameo appearance from a novel from a character in the Alice Network, and a lot of people who have read The Yellowbird Sings have been asking me, like they ask you about Ruth, have asked me, you know, are you going to tell us what happens, you know, later? Sort of, I can't really say exactly what I'm talking about here because I'll be spoiling it, but I decided that there is a way that I can move this story forward, but I'm going to be like focusing on another part of history and two other completely different characters who later kind of loop in. So I'm really, really excited about it. It just started to get traction now. It's been like a while of flailing around, and I'm so excited. So yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful to hear. And I think cameo appearances are fun. I like doing them in books, and it's kind of like that, you know, like that Stan Lee cameo you always are looking for in a Marvel movie. It's just always fun when you get crossover. But I also noticed, let's see. Well, I also
Kate,
had the same question for me was, what am I working on? Dorothy Morgan Schwab. All right, yes, I am working on right now, I just finished and handed in really, my next book, which is called The Rose Code, and that is about the female code breakers of Bletchley Park during World War II. And that's a fabulous bit of history because it is this whole period when the best and brightest minds in England were being, both men and women, were being rounded up and recruited to work at this remote country house in Buckinghamshire, and they were put to work to break the supposedly uncrackable German military codes. And they succeeded so spectacularly that it is estimated they shortened World War II by as much as 2 years, and certainly millions of lives. So to link our books up even more, if those Bletchley Park code breakers had not been working away, God knows if your poor ladies would have made it in Yellowbird Sings if the war had dragged on another few years. So we have another question here from Kate Kirkwood. How many rewrites do you do, Jennifer?
Well, let's see. Many, and I was going to say I work in a way that's very slow. So in some ways I go sentence by sentence in a slow way, but I feel like I was on page 11 for like 3 years. I kept rewriting it was always 11 pages. I never could get past for like, a long time, and then finally like tumbled forward. But I don't know, there's no formula to what happens for me. I think each thing I write has been very different in this way, but it takes a really long time for me, and I just have to accept my process was pretty slow and kind of give it its respect for what it is, and just live with it. But I think that on the one hand there are certain sentences that have stayed from the start through, and then on the other hand, actually in this novel, I had written out almost like 30 years of these lives, and then cut it to 5 and did a little jump in time. So there's a lot on the cutting room floor there. There's a lot. Yeah.
From Gabby Bolivar, how did the ideas come to you to become books?
I mean, I mentioned how I had met this hidden child, and it like stimulated all this stuff. And now for the new novel I'm working on, within one of those interviews I had done, someone had told me something that was really interesting, and it's also stuck with me. I think that a lot of novelists, like, they'll just hear this one little thing and it'll kind of keep like, simmering inside until you realize you want to talk about it. But I think that in that case, I heard this thing about how after the war, there were Jewish children who had been hidden in these Christian settings. And then there was this funding that America gave to help get those children back into Jewish settings, because they had lost so many Jews. They were trying to kind of get them back. But meanwhile, like from a moral standpoint, it's like, a child has lost their initial family. Then they got into this Polish family. If they were bonded with that Polish family, now someone was coming in to move them from that family into a Jewish setting. So, in order to save this, in the larger sense, save a race that had been under so much, duress, they're taking this individual whose bonding life is very particular. Anyway, I thought a lot about that, because that must have been very hard for some people. And it's also like hard for their sense of self and identity, because of like their sense of personal identity, their sense of religious identity being moved around like that. So I don't know, I just heard this thing and I got really interested in it. I imagine it's similar for you with like you find something in history that hasn't been explored much. I know that with the Night Witches and now maybe with the Code Breakers.
Yeah, I think it's very much a similar thing. If we think of the fire hose of information that we go through in the course of life, the things we read, the things that that flow past us online, the think pieces, the isn't this cool that you see on the internet, millions of bits of information. And, it's different for every writer what that fish hook snags, but I do think it's almost like a fish hook. It grabs something and hauls it up for you, and that's when you get this sort of light bulb in your head that's like, this could be a book. And you really have to have that moment, and I've had that moment a number of times, and it really has been, it's always wonderful, when you're like, eureka, this is it. And so it also has to be some generally historical moment, historical event, historical figure. Another question we have further down is, it's World War II that we're talking about, a lot of World War II events. Are there any other historic periods you're interested in writing about? For me, I've written about the Renaissance and also about ancient Rome, and these were other, periods that I happen to love and know well. And it was the same thing, I would get a particular, historical figure or event that would just snag me in my imagination, and there would be my thought that there will be a story here. So have you thought about writing about other historical periods?
I mean, I have a bunch of notes that are about really, it's not, I mean, it's about this current moment about climate change and just because, you know, I have a 16 and a 19-year-old, two daughters who are so affected carrying this with them sort of in every moment of their life. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think every generation has carried like fears for the world, but our kids are carrying a lot of fears. And so while, you know, no, I guess I wouldn't, I mean, it's a current moment that I think that if I do another thing, maybe I'll work on that, because it just feels so like we need to get a character that, you know, someone will be fully identified with. If we can't identify with our own plight and the plight of our children, maybe there's some character whose plight we're going to really identify with and start changing our behavior. I don't know.
So did anyone in your family read your book, and what were the reactions? It's another question we've had from Rena Argawal Gilja. I'm sorry if I mispronounced. Do forgive me.
Yes, a lot of, my dad died before he was able to read the book, which makes me really sad, especially all the violin parts and just the fact that it was dedicated to him and that he really inspired me in a lot of ways. And so that was very hard, but my mom has read it and has been this big champion of it, really happy about it. So it's always nice. And my siblings, I don't know, they're running a little late, I should say, but my husband's family has been, you know, reading it. Yeah. So, and my daughters have read it, and one daughter read it like 4 times a draft, really invested in kind of the different parts of the plot. And my other daughter said she was afraid to read it in case she didn't think it was very good. So and then finally read it and said it is good. You know, so you know how it is.
Yeah, my mother is actually my first reader, really, my first written
nice.
partner. She is always my, really the first one who reads anything I write. And it's, she's wonderful because she's a librarian, or retired now, and she is a tremendously sharp reader. I mean, you know, absolute, like a razor. And it's wonderful because, you know, I always laugh when people tell me, it's like, well, you can't rely on your family members to give you honest feedback. And I'm like, oh my God, you have not met my mother. She has no problem telling me if it's writing on the margin, the scene is dim and stagey and the pacing is way off. You know, and the thing is that makes her sound really harsh and awful. No, she's great. She loves my books, but she is very good at being able to tell me where I need to improve them. And, you know, that was such an invaluable thing when I was growing up and, you know, kind of trying to learn how to hone a story. You know, this was absolutely, it was absolutely wonderful. So I was going to end up with one more question, I thought, which was, what are we reading today right now? Because we can always end up with some good book recommendations. I do know there are some more questions here. I will want to encourage everyone, if you still have questions we did not get to, go ahead and put them down. And Jennifer and I will stop back and see if we can go ahead and you know, answer some of those questions if we didn't manage to get to them in time. But, you know, again, just thank you guys, everybody, for tuning in. And again, order your books from Booksmith. And oh, by the way, Jennifer and I are going to be mailing Booksmith some book plates, autographed book plates. So you can get an autographed copy if you order a copy of The Huntress or Yellowbird Sings from Booksmith. And I know Booksmith will be happy to give you ordering information. But to give you some other ideas for other books you can throw on that order while you are ordering your, putting your order together. Jennifer, what are you reading right now? What are you recommending?
So I just finished The Vanishing Half, and I really liked that, by Britt Bennett. And I also just finished The Girl with the Louding Voice, which I thought was terrific as well. And I read The Overstory by Richard Powers, which was also terrific. There's, I don't know, I could recommend, I read The Secrets We Kept, is that what it's called? Yes, and I really liked that book very much. And yeah, there's just so many. I've been kind of on a reading binge, which is good, because at the beginning of the pandemic, I found it very hard to read, and I've kind of been able to settle in. In fact, Writers and Lovers, Lily King's book, was the one that let me get back into reading. So I really have a fond feeling toward that book as well. What about you? What are you reading?
A number of really great things right now. I just am reading my way through Justina Ireland's Dread Nation series. Wonderful. It's zombies meets this American Civil War, and a wonderful African-American girl who is an absolute badass and takes no prisoners and is a zombie killer. And it's wonderful escapism, and the writing and the voice is so fresh, so absolutely vivid and gripping. I love that. That's Dread Nation, Justina, Ireland. Another one I've been recommending is Janie Chang's The Library of Legends, which is a wonderful story about a Chinese university in the 30s that takes to the open road to get away from the invasion of Nanking by the Japanese. And if you are a parent who's been having homeschooling issues, you have no idea what homeschooling issues you are until you read about these these Chinese professors who are literally slinging the lesson plan on their backs for the class marching behind to be able to read and discuss on, today's 30-mile trek through a war zone in between diving into ditches to get away from being strafed by planes. And then for something, just wonderfully dishy and escapist, Stephanie Thornton's And They Called It Camelot, about Jackie Kennedy Onassis, so wonderfully inside Jackie's head that you feel like you're reading a page of her diary and eavesdropping on her life. So my books I would recommend are Janie Chang's The Library of Legends, Stephanie Thornton's And They Called It Camelot, and Dread Nation, Justina, Ireland. So more books for you to add to the TBR list. So anyway, can we turn it back to Booksmith, and just want to give everybody our thanks. And anything else you want to add? I mean, we could probably yatter here all night, but we've been going for 45 minutes.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much. I love talking to you, and thank you to everyone who tuned in, and thank you to Booksmith. And I hope that you will use their delivery service and order your books from them.
Oh, and I did want to add, we know that we were talking to Booksmith earlier, and they said that you might see something on the website where it says things are out of stock. That's because things have been coming from the warehouse. Go ahead and please don't be discouraged by the out of stock. Things are going to be orderable. So go ahead and make your order there anyway.
Thank you, Kate. You've been wonderful, and thank you, Jennifer. This has been really lovely conversation between you guys. And congratulations on your book. Best of luck with everything. For those of you who are watching at home, thank you for joining us. The books are available from Booksmith, like we mentioned. I've dropped the links in the comments. Please order and enjoy. I hope we can all gather in person sometime soon. In the meanwhile, please take care, stay well, fight like hell. Thank you. Thank you all. Have a good night. Thank you, Jennifer and Kate.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.